in Bismarck. It's always a blessing to be here. Not too long ago, I was in a conversation that changed the way that I think about life, and I'd like to talk to you about it just for a moment. I was sitting at a table listening to a presentation by a gentleman by the name of Christian Smith. Christian works at the University of Notre Dame. He's a sociologist, and I had never met Christian. I had read some of his articles. I had seen him speak, but I'd never had a chance to meet him. By chance, by providence, he happened to be sitting right next to me as he gave this presentation to a small group. And during a break, I said, Christian, I've been a big fan of your work. He knows more about young people and about their practice of faith than anybody in the world. And as I sat there and talked to him, I introduced myself. He said, oh my goodness, I like Focus. I've known about your work, but we've never had a chance to meet. And I said, well, it's great. He goes, you're going to love my new book. And I'd love to talk to you just a moment about his new book. It's actually just coming out right now this month. He said, what we did, Curtis, is that my team of about 100 researchers met with hundreds and hundreds of families. And those families that had raised children and they had all left the faith, we talked to them. And we found hundreds and hundreds of families who raised their children, and all of them had kept their faith. And our team asked them hundreds of questions. What did you do? What did you not do? And it's been my experience in the last 30 years that when I meet people my age or older, the number one question is, what am I supposed to do with my kids, my grandkids? It's the biggest heartache in our lives to have a family member who's not practicing the faith, and I have family members who are not practicing the faith. And it's the greatest joy, and it will be 1,000,000 years from now, the greatest joy to have family members who are practicing the faith. It's a great joy for me to look and turn to my children who are now grown. They were not always great. Some of them were quite a piece of work during the day. But at this point in time, they're all practicing their faith. I've got the eldest of the 9 is just turned 29 2 days ago, and the youngest is 5. And we have 5 grandchildren as introduced. And they all, the ones we take to church all practice their faith, but the ones that we don't take to church also practice their faith. And it's a great thing to see that 2 of the 9 are actually missionaries with Focus. And it's a joy to share faith with them. And I can tell you that whether it's Thanksgiving or Christmas or Easter, when you're gathered together and you have family members who do not practice the faith, it's one of the greatest sources of sorrow in our lives. And so I want to talk to you about what Christian Smith shared with me. He said, this is what the families who raised children who all practice the faith, this is the habit they had that made all the difference. He said many, many, many things made a difference. That you drove them to Mass every Sunday made a difference. That you prayed the rosary as a family made a difference. That you had dinner together as a family made a difference. But the one thing that made a difference more than any other thing, and by this time, as I hope you are, I was leaning in. Tell me this, because this is all that matters to me. Here's the reality. All that matters is heaven and hell. It's the only thing. 1,000 years from now, 1,000,000 years from now, nothing else will matter. Here's a conversation that never takes place in hell. Hey, when I was on earth, I used to drive a Ferrari. Because the response would be, who cares? You are on fire. And here's the conversation that never takes place in heaven. Hey, when I was on earth, I used to drive a Ferrari. Because the response will be, who cares? You can fly. See, nothing in this earth matters at all unless we get this one right. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and then all these things can be added on. But if you miss this, you lose cosmically. To recognize this is all that matters. And now I'm listening to this guy, Christian Smith, who understands young people better than anybody on earth. He's studied young people for most of his lifetime from a faithful Catholic perspective. A brilliant guy, and he says, I know the one thing that makes the biggest difference. I'm like, okay, tell me. I hope you're kind of thinking you'd like me to tell you too. And he said that the families that raised practicing Catholics had spiritual conversations with their children on a regular basis. They had spiritual conversations. I said, wow, okay, that seems pretty simple. And at the same time, how do we do that? It struck me as I listened to him, I thought about my sponsor for confirmation. And Tom's a great guy, really committed Catholic. He was the father of a couple of my best friends. And Tom was my sponsor into confirmation. And I have a younger brother, we're both adopted, and he was my younger brother's sponsor into confirmation. And my dad's a convert, and he was my dad's sponsor into confirmation. And a couple years ago, my dad passed away. Tom gave the eulogy. Tom is a very close personal friend. And it struck me as I listened to Christian about spiritual conversations that even though Tom is a very committed Catholic and a very close friend, I had never once had a spiritual conversation with him. Not because he's a bad guy, but because he doesn't know how to do it. And so what I'd like to do in our session this morning is I'd like to share with you how to have a spiritual conversation and to be able to recognize that this is what God is inviting us to do. And when we do it, it's the most effective tool to help people practice their faith, whether it's keeping our kids or our grandkids Catholic or inviting other people to become Catholic. This is the tool. And the hope is that we would make missionary disciples. I had a chance, thanks to Edward Sri, I call him Ted because I've known him for a long time, but Edward will be here later this evening. But thanks to Ted and others, I had a chance to write a book called Making Missionary Disciples. And I'm going to talk to you about that in this session. Because living the Christian life in this world is kind of like standing on an escalator that's going down. If you're not striving to walk up, you will be pulled down in the wrong direction. This culture's tough. We work with college students on about 200 universities around the country, and it's tough out there. And the beautiful thing is young people are responding. In fact, as I listened to Christian Smith tell me that having spiritual conversations was the most significant factor, I was very confirmed because in some ways for the last 21 years, that's all we've been trying to do is help young people on college campus to have spiritual conversations. But how do we do that? What does that look like? It does not mean let's talk about the church. I love the church, and I hope you do too. But it means talking about Jesus Christ and the great figures of salvation history, to capture people's imagination and our own imagination with who he is and who they are. So my invitation to you is to an exercise that you would consider prayerfully, that for 5 to 10 minutes every day, just 5 to 10 minutes, usually in the morning, that you would open up the scriptures. And I would encourage you, just Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, those first 5 books of the New Testament. Because in those 5 books, we encounter Jesus Christ more powerfully than in any of the other books. And once we are thinking and praying about these books, the rest of the books come alive in new ways. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But not to read them like Americans. You know, you talk to Americans, they'll say, you know, have you ever read the book of Matthew? And they'll say, yes, I did it in 15 minutes. No, not as fast as you can. Actually, really, really slowly. Really slowly. Just a little piece at a time. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to read a section from Luke chapter 5 that you all know. It's read to us a couple times a year in Mass. And you know this, but as I read it to you, I'm going to read it to you slowly. I'm only going to take about 2 minutes to do it. So this doesn't take a lot of time. But then what I'm going to do after that is I'm going to go back and tell you what I thought about this passage. And I'm only going to take 3 or 4 minutes to do that. But it's going to be the beginning of what would be a spiritual conversation if you and I were talking face to face. It's hard to do that when it's 1,000 people to one, but we can start that conversation today. Luke chapter 5. It's the calling of Simon or St. Peter. And Jesus saw 2 boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, Jesus asked him to put out a little from the shore. And he sat down and he began to teach the people. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we've toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word I will let down the nets." And when he had done this, they enclosed a great shoal of fish. And as their nets were breaking, they beckoned to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they filled both boats so that they began to sink. And when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees and saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man." And Jesus responded, "Do not be afraid. Henceforth, you will be catching men." Now, my invitation to spend 5 or 10 minutes, or 15 if you like, reading the scriptures, particularly Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Acts, and then repeat 3 or 4 times, and then you can read the rest as you want. But to read every day, the hope would be that you would become filled with thoughts about who Jesus is and what he did. Because as modern Americans, we tend to want to get information and share information. And St. Bernard, or Bernard, said this: we should not try to get information and share it. Kind of like a canal or a channel of water that just receives water and moves on. He says we should be more like a reservoir that receives and receives and receives, and then of the overflow. And as I landed yesterday, I know that you folks here know what overflow looks like. And to recognize that it's not that I'm going to share everything I've learned, it's that of the many things I've learned, I'm going to share some of them, and those will become spiritual conversations. So here's what I have thought and prayed about as I looked at this brief passage. Jesus shows up, and Peter has been working all night. He's been fishing, and he's caught nothing. By the way, I've read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I know that in John, there's the only other time that Peter, who's a professional fisherman, the only other time that Peter is referred to as having gone fishing, both times he catches nothing. That's got to be a little humiliating, right? Both times, all night, nothing. This is the first time. And so Jesus shows up. They've been fishing all night. They're washing their nets. And Jesus says, I'm going to use your boat. And push out a little bit, and I'm going to teach. And Jesus, while he's teaching, I got to believe he's kind of watching Peter as Peter's washing his nets. And he's teaching to the people. There's probably hundreds of people. He's teaching them. But he's watching Simon Peter, and he's washing his nets. And just about the time that Simon Peter finishes washing his nets, Jesus turns to him and says, I'd like to go out into the deep, and I'd like to go fishing. And if it were me, I'd be like, look, I've been up all night long. I'm kind of ticked off. And by the way, what I hate more than anything about fishing, I hate washing my nets. And you watched me wash my nets, and you waited until I was done and then said, let's go fishing again. If you knew we were going fishing, could you just say, hey, don't wash your nets yet? Because the only thing I hate worse than washing my nets is staying up all night and catching no fish, which, by the way, did I tell you, I also did that. So this is a bad time for you to ask me, and by the way, aren't you a carpenter? What do you know about fishing? But that's not what he said. He said, Master, which is amazing. He already understood that Jesus was somehow at least a great rabbi, maybe the Messiah, I don't know. But he said, okay. And he goes out, and to his great surprise, he catches the best catch of fish he's ever had. He's out there with his brother Andrew, who will also become an apostle, and they signal to James and John, who will also become apostles, and the 4 of them catch the biggest catch of fish they've ever had. And what Peter does is he falls on his knees and says, depart from me, I'm a sinful man. That is not what I would have done. I would have said, we should go into business together, because you're amazing at fishing. And we could call it Simon and Jesus' fish. Or no, Jesus and I'll let you have the top billing, because you're great at this. But see, Jesus doesn't want to be Simon Peter's partner. He wants to be the Lord of Simon Peter's life. He wants Simon Peter to give him everything, to quit his job and follow him. And the question I would have for you is, if you ever had a moment where you felt like Jesus was asking you to quit your job. You may not have to quit your job. Lots of people don't, but they're willing to. When you've had the experience of following Jesus Christ, of hearing him, of having him rock your world. I mean, they had the best catch of their life. They're professional fishermen, and they leave all of it. They don't clean a single fish. They turn to their elderly fathers, Simon and Andrew's father and James and John's father, and say, here you go. So a couple boatloads of fish, we quit. And all 4 of them leave to go follow Jesus. And I think I'd love to have a spiritual conversation with each one of you about that, and with your children and your grandchildren. This is how powerful Jesus is. We live in a world where people are growing up and losing their faith. But here you see people coming to faith because they encountered the person of Jesus Christ, who is so powerful. And here's the other piece of this. It would have been so much easier for Simon to just keep his fishing job. He was a good fisherman, I'm sure. Yeah, he went over on 2 different nights, but I'm sure he was a decent fisherman. And he would have lived a nice, ordinary life. Instead, he chose to quit and follow Jesus. And because of that, he was imprisoned and beaten and stoned and crucified upside down. And the reality of the matter is that there are 2 truths about our Christian faith, and they're almost the opposite of one another. The first one is that Jesus offers us, God offers us in Jesus, salvation for free. There's nothing we can do to be justified. He gives us that gift. The Catechism teaches us that the gift of initial justification is free, it's unmerited, we can't earn it. And it's the reality. You can sit back and think about, look, I have these children, they said 9. They're all girls, except for 8 of them. And so I have 8 sons and 1 daughter. But you can see, what I've got these kids, and we're living, and what if the kid across the street came over and said, hey, Mr. Martin, I watch your kids, they mow the lawn, and they wash your car, and they take out the garbage, and I'm thinking, I would like to become a member of your family. How many times would I have to mow your lawn to do that? It's silly when you think about it. That's not what happens. My children's relationship to me is a free gift. It was given to both of us by God. They didn't do anything to become my children. They just showed up. And you can't earn that. And yet, once they are my children, they do have chores. And what I'd like to talk to you about that is, yes, our salvation, our justification is a free gift. You can't earn it. It's like being a son or daughter. And yet, once you are a son or daughter, you have chores. And discipleship, whew, now that's costly. Jesus said, if you want to be my disciple, you must deny yourself daily and pick up your cross and follow me. And I think about how costly it was for Simon Peter to choose to quit his job. Or we could switch to another great disciple, the Blessed Virgin Mary. And I'd like to take a brief look at the Blessed Virgin Mary and see how costly discipleship is for her. And it is for you and for me, if we choose to embrace radical discipleship. Mary was minding her own business. Some of the Jewish scholars would say it was probably on Passover, but maybe not. But she probably had the Passover meal, and then she went outside, minding her own business, and all of a sudden an angel shows up and says, I want you to be the mother of the Messiah. And every hope and dream that this young girl had, every one of them went out the window. And an entire new sets of hopes and dreams entered her life. And she said, let it be done to me according to thy word. And her entire life shifted. Every hope, every dream. You have hopes and dreams. Every hope and dream that she had, gone. And a new path given to her. This, we're told then she went in haste to go visit Elizabeth, who was pregnant with John the Baptist. It's a 4 to 5 day walk. And she was 14, 15 years old. Doesn't say that she was with anybody. It was a dangerous walk. There were robbers and thieves. There's a path up over the mountains that goes through the Samaritan villages who don't like the Jews, or there's the one down by the river that takes a little longer. I don't know which one, we're not told which one she went on. But a 4 or 5 day walk, just one way. And for 3 months, she, now newly pregnant, served Elizabeth, who was carrying John the Baptist. After that, she walked home 4 or 5 days, and then we found out there's going to be a census, and she had to go down to Bethlehem, another 4 or 5 day journey, and she went down. She's now 9 months pregnant and ready to give birth. There's no room at the inn. She has to give birth in a cave. to her baby. Afterwards, she goes home. She then has to go down to Jerusalem for the presentation. That's another 4 or 5 day walk. And she goes to the presentation, and she's told, this child is appointed for the rise and fall of many, and a sword of sorrow will pierce your heart. A few years later, we're told that she travels again to Jerusalem with now Jesus as a young boy, and on the way home, she and Joseph realize they've lost Jesus. By the way, these are the joyful mysteries. Discipleship is brutal. To be a disciple of Jesus Christ is brutal. It's costly. Yes, our status as a son or daughter of God, free. The reality of being a disciple, brutal. And here's been my experience. My experience is that young people love that. They don't want easy Christianity. They're bored by it. I don't think you do either. Because when we read stories about boring, easy Christians, we are bored by them. But when we read the stories of the great followers of God, going back to the book of Genesis, all the way through the life of Jesus into the lives of the saints, it's the stories that are compelling. Those are the ones that were actually pretty difficult. And our world is waiting for us to become great lovers of God. We're at a transition point in the church. We have people that are faithful, God bless them, to the institutional church. And I'd like to think that I'm one of them. We ask our missionaries at Focus, every single one of them, to take the oath of fidelity to the Catholic Church. Everything the church teaches, faith, morals, all of it, we're all in. We believe it all. I love the church. But way, way, way more than I love the church, I love Jesus. And young people today have very little interest in the institutions. And to the degree they think of their faith as a faith that involves the institution of the church, they become bored. And here's the deal. Peter wasn't thinking about the institution of the church that day on the lake. He was looking at Jesus saying, oh my goodness, you're a master even over fish. You can do anything. And over the next 3 years, he watched Jesus perform miracles and heal people, raise people from the dead. He watched Jesus calm the sea. His loyalty was to Jesus Christ. And what I've experienced is that when young people commit their lives to the person of Jesus Christ, who's alive and well, after the resurrection, still alive, and when they commit to him, they also love his church. But when they just understand the church, they sometimes don't even see him. And I was with a friend of mine a couple years ago, Peter Herbeck, and Peter said to me, Curtis, it's been my experience that the vast majority of Catholics are in a loveless marriage with God. They're really united, they're really in covenant because they're baptized Catholics. But when you talk to them, it sounds like there's just not a lot of love there. It's not that they hate God at all, but they don't think about him in a personal way. And really, that's the key to inviting people of all ages into the faith. The key. Because sometimes I do this a lot, I'll go out and talk to young people or people of all ages about their faith, and when I do, they frequently behave like basketball players late in the game. When you see a basketball player late in the game, they put their hands on their legs this way. They're tired. When the guy defending you goes like this, it's a really good time to go for the basket. Because he's gassed, he's tired. And I talk to people about their faith, they're like, so how's your Catholic faith going? Always Lent. And I realize that just what Peter said, they're in a loveless marriage, because when you ask me about my marriage, that's not how I respond. When you ask me about my marriage, I sit back and say, this has been, next month, 30 years, I'm the luckiest guy on earth. I remember the day that I married Michael Ann, and I'm just up there in the sanctuary of the church thinking, if she doesn't figure out that I'm marrying way up in the next 10 minutes, I win. and I did. And it's awesome. And there's been hundreds and thousands of terrible things that we've had to endure, dirty diapers and snotty noses and all kinds of big bills. in our marriage, but it never makes me go like this, because I'm married to Michael Ann. And there's terrible things that you have to do as a Catholic. Terrible. You have to deny yourself every day and pick up your cross and follow him. And sometimes that's really, really hard. In this culture, it's getting harder. And yet, if you know that your relationship with Jesus is the primary reality of why you're a Catholic, it's okay. Even Jesus himself had to endure terrible things. And I'm struck by the book of Hebrews that says this about Jesus' passion. It says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. For the joy set before him, he endured. That means that when Jesus was looking at the scourging and the crowning of thorns and the carrying the cross and the crucifixion and all, how terrible that was. I mean, just the worst day of his life. But when he was looking at it, he was looking past it to something else. And I really believe what he was looking at, I've thought about this a fair amount, what I think he was looking at you. Not you all, you. The Catechism says that when Jesus experienced his passion and death, he thought of each of us personally. He thought about you. And for the joy of your salvation, he endured the cross because he just loves you that much. And for the joy of your salvation, you should be able to encounter anything also, so that Catholics would not be in a loveless marriage with God, but a love-filled adventure that calls young people and people of all ages to the kind of life that we would talk about. Because here's the deal, if Simon had kept his day job and stayed a fisherman, we would not be talking about him because we'd never heard of him. But because he quit his job and followed Jesus, he became the first pope. And his life changed all of our lives. And young people today, in our world today, are longing for people to embrace Jesus in a radical, radical way. To sit back and say, I'm willing to suffer for you and for them. I'm willing to do this because you have captivated me. You have captivated me. In the introduction, I mentioned a book that I wrote that's out there called Made for More. And this is the message we're trying to share with young people on college campuses. And I would say, knowing that I'm here in town in North Dakota, one of the best places to go to learn how to have spiritual conversations, University of Mary. Oh my goodness. What Monsignor Shea is doing there, and those professors are teaching young people that the faith is a vibrant reality of relationship. That because they're in a relationship with Christ and the church and all the saints and one another and the poor, and we're there to serve, it's a beautiful place to learn how to have spiritual conversations. To recognize that if we were to spend some time, 10, 15 minutes a day, reading the scriptures, primarily Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts, and then repeat, and after 3 or 4 times, read all the rest as well, God would fill us up. We would have thoughts about the calling of Simon Peter. I will share in the breakout session later another incident in the book of Matthew where Jesus has just fed the 5,000. But we would have thoughts and impressions of dozens and dozens and dozens of interactions with Jesus. And they'll just start to flow out of us because we've been thinking about them and reading them and praying them. And to recognize that by living that way, Pope Benedict XVI said this. He said, if Catholics were to prayerfully read the scriptures on a daily basis, it would bring about the new springtime. Now, I don't know what your thoughts are of the Catholic Church and being Catholic at this point in time in your life. I would argue that the last 18 months have probably been the hardest of my life. It's not easy to be Catholic. The church is going through a purification. And God be praised, may it happen as quickly and perfectly as it can, because judgment begins with the household of God, because it's not just the church that's broken, our culture is broken. And good cultures make it easy to become good people, and bad cultures make it easy to become bad people, and we live in a bad culture. And so to be able to recognize, Jesus walked into the world, and he's stepping into our world today through the Eucharist, to make the bad culture good again, to help people to live good and holy lives and to live with him forever. And Pope Benedict said, if we were to pray the scriptures, which is my invitation to you today, on a daily basis, pray them, not just read them like Americans, but to really slow down and to read, that this would bring about the new springtime. Because let me tell you about the best evangelist. I am called an evangelist. I hope that I am. But the best evangelist in all of history was the first evangelist, Blessed Virgin Mary. She was the first person to receive Jesus. She received him so perfectly, she actually received him in the flesh. But she received him in her heart, as St. Augustine said, before she conceived our Lord in her womb, she conceived him in her heart. So she received him, and then she received him. But she also shared him. And she shared him at the visitation. She went in haste after the Annunciation. She went to serve Elizabeth. And what's amazing is, when she showed up, both Elizabeth and the baby John in Elizabeth's womb were both filled with the Holy Spirit when she said, Shalom. There was no, let me tell you about the theology of Jesus Christ and the Messiah. No, it was, Shalom. Oh, we're both filled with the Holy Spirit. And this is why. The fathers of the church tell us about this, and it's true for each of us, but it's most true for Mary. The fathers of the church said, what does it mean to become a Christian? To be a person who Christ is the central reality of your life. And they said, imagine a burning hot fire and a cold iron beam, just a rod of iron. They have nothing in common, hot burning fire, cold iron beam. But if you were to take that iron beam and place it in the fire, something amazing starts to happen. After a while, the cold iron rod now is hot. And eventually it actually begins to glow. It will never become the fire. God and us, we are completely different. We'll never become God. But the iron beam starts to take on the properties of the fire, the way that Christians begin to take on the properties of God, to the point you can take the iron rod out and touch it to some dry grass and actually start a fire. Originally, you would never think that it could do that. But because it had been sitting in the fire, basking in the presence of the fire, it takes on the property of the fire. And that's what Mary did. She's not God. She's not our Savior. But she was so close and so united to God that when she showed up and said, Shalom, to Elizabeth, Elizabeth and the baby John in her womb were both filled with the Holy Spirit. And that's why the Holy Father is saying, if you and I would spend time in the Scriptures every day prayerfully, it would bring about the new springtime. Because in a certain way, it prepares us to receive Jesus in the Eucharist, because the sacraments are really the key here. Just as Jesus, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the womb of the Blessed Virgin Mary, was the key to her being able to take on the properties of God, so Jesus, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist is the key for us. But the tool to open our hearts and minds to be able to receive him is the daily prayerful reading of Scriptures, which equip us for spiritual conversations. To sit back and say, have you ever had, I think I had to quit my job moment over Jesus Christ? Because he wants you to have that. Have you ever had that situation where you felt frustrated because things weren't going well? I've been up all night, I caught nothing. I've been washing my nets. Those are my two least favorite things to do in my life. Fish and catch nothing and wash my nets. And now you want me to go fishing as soon as I finish washing the nets. I've been up all night. I'm so tired. Are you really asking me to do that? Yeah. Jesus calls us out of our comfort zone all the time. All the time. We live in this world. And St. Augustine, who's one of my favorite, named one of my kids after St. Augustine. I actually now have one of my other kids named one of their kids Augustine in honor of both St. Augustine and my son Augustine. I love Augustine. St. Augustine wrote a couple of books. He wrote a book about his life with God called The Confessions. And in the Confessions, he tells his story of how Jesus came into his life just as he came into Simon's life. It's a beautiful book. Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee is probably one of the most famous lines of the Confessions. He wrote another book called Catechesis Rudibus. Sorry, I don't know how to translate that. Catechesis Rudibus. And what she said, he responds, a deacon, Augustine's a bishop at this time, a deacon says, hey, when I teach catechism to my people, they get bored. Maybe you've experienced this. And he said, what do I do? And essentially what he says in that book is, tell them stories. Tell them stories. You know what stories are? They're spiritual conversations. Tell them stories. And in the third book that he wrote, called The City of God, he tells the great story of humanity. And just to simplify that for a second, he essentially says this. There are two, quote-unquote, cities in the world. There's the city of man and the city of God. And it's not geographical. People live in one city or the other, even sometimes in the same house, in the same country. The difference is that in the city of God, people love God so much that they're willing to deny themselves. And in the city of man, people love themselves so much, they're willing to deny God. And that's the reality of our world. It won't go away until Jesus comes back and the world is over. It's divided in these two great cities, and you need to choose which one you want to live in. And if you don't choose, you are in the city of man, because that's where we're born and that's where we tend. We have to actually make a choice. It's like that down escalator. If you're not climbing up, you are losing ground. And to recognize that. And there's only two ways to grow the city of God. Procreation, having children, having Catholic families, having children, and evangelization, inviting people who aren't Catholic or who are Catholic but have fallen away from the practice of Catholicism to come back. Those are the only two ways to grow it. And the people in the city of man hate the family because that's where both of these occur. And they hate evangelization. But to be able to recognize this is the tension in our life, and here's the great joy. Yes, the people in the city of man hate the city of God. Yes, that's true. Here's the game changer, though. We in the city of God do not hate them. We're not fighting against them. We fight against the devil. We're fighting for them. They're not the enemy. The people in our culture that we disagree with are not the enemy. They're the prize. They're the prize. And we need to fight for them, which means that we have to love him so much more than we do so we can love them because they drive us crazy, right? And you sit back and say, I disagree. I would spend the rest of my life arguing with you about these facts. I totally disagree with you, but I don't hate you. I actually love you. And to be able to recognize the difference between the two cities are that the city of man hates those they disagree with, and the city of God doesn't. We love those we disagree with, even though we do tremendously disagree with many of them. And to recognize this is the challenge. Because here's the reality. And what we're going to talk about in the breakout session later today. There's an evangelical imperative. We are relaxed. I deal with college students all the time, and the average college-age guy, I'm sad to say, is spending 3 to 5 hours a day playing video games. And that's not their biggest problem. They're also looking at pornography almost every day, about 90+% of them, and about 50% of the women on college campuses. They're living broken lives. They're also abusing substances, alcohol, and different drugs. And when you talk to them and they're playing a video game, and you sit back and say, hey, look, I'm not hurting anybody. Well, wait a second. It depends on who you are. What do you mean you're not hurting anybody? Because here's the deal. If you're a fireman and the alarm goes off and you choose to just continue to play a video game, you're absolutely hurting somebody because you're supposed to be someplace else. And to be able to recognize, do you realize why you're here? And most young people just don't know why they're here. To realize that right now on earth, today, there are literally millions of people who are starving to death. There are literally millions of people who have no fresh and clean water to drink. There are literally millions of people who do not have adequate basic health care. There are millions of people who are not safe. I remember hearing a talk about poverty not too long ago. And the person who was giving the talk ran an organization that helped the poor on a global level. They said, what do you think the number one concern of poor people is? And I immediately said, well, probably food and water. Thought about it for a while, and he goes, no, it's safety. He told this story. He said, in the first world, up in the Pacific Northwest, a woman called 911. She heard something in the bushes around her house, and she wasn't sure what it was. She called 911, and she said, hi, I think there's somebody outside my house. I have been the victim of rape, and the gentleman, the guy who raped me, got out of prison within the last month. I don't know if it's who it is out there, but I think there's somebody outside, and I need you to come and get whoever's out there. While she was talking, she realized it was in fact a person, it was in fact the guy, and she heard on the 911, due to recent budget cuts, we're not able to service that area. And the guy broke into her house and raped her again. This is the reality for millions of people today, and our young people are watching video games. There are more slaves on earth today than there have been at any point in time in our life. Sex slaves and traditional work slaves, tens of millions today. And our young people are watching video games. They're supposed to be supermen and superwomen, alive in Christ. Because here's the deal, we don't believe in reincarnation. We don't. In fact, I love the Catechism of the Catholic Church. If you open up to the index in the back, it says reincarnation, it just says no. It doesn't even give you a page number, it just says no. We don't believe in it, which means we don't have any time. We've got it going now. They're suffering, they're hungry and thirsty and sick and scared and enslaved, and we could change that if we would come alive like Simon Peter did, like St. Francis of Assisi did, like St. Augustine, like St. John Paul, to be able to recognize that this is the reality that we live in. We were created by God, not just created by him, but created to live right now, to address the problems in the world right now. And of all the poverties that people suffer, food and water, medicine, safety, and escaping from slavery, which are all amazingly horrible realities, none of those are the biggest realities. The biggest reality is the vast majority of people on earth today do not know that there's a loving God who is merciful and sent his son to save them. Because even if you fed them today, they would be hungry again tomorrow. But if you could bring the gospel to them, they could live forever. And it's our call to address poverty in all of its forms, starting with the most immediate and leading to the most important. Yes, it would be crazy to walk up to a starving person and say, I want to talk to you about God. No, feed them and then talk to them about God. But they'll recognize this. And we're watching now tens of thousands of young people on college campuses now going out into the second, third world. Some of those second, third world places are actually in the United States. They're in the poor sections of the United States. But sending them by the thousands out to care for their needs and watch the young people come alive because they realize, oh my goodness, I see this over and over again. Oh my goodness, I went to Peru and met these people who had nothing, and I have everything, and they were happy, and I'm miserable. I have to live differently. I have to live for God, and I have to live for other people. To have this recognition that this generation of Catholics is responsible for this generation of people. We have no room for video games. I'm not hurting anybody. Are you kidding me? You're supposed to go out and rescue people. You're killing them by playing video games. You have the ability to rescue people, and you're not. And they don't even know it. And to be able to share this compelling reality so that every one of our young people and every one of us at any age would realize, I have a quit my job type of moment. I mean, you may not have to quit your job, but I'm willing to. But what I am going to do is I'm going to live totally differently. Depart from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man. No. Come to me. I can heal your sin and make you a fisher of men. To recognize that what St. Catherine of Siena said so many years ago is true. It's become, when it was first read to me at Mass, it was an antiphon at Mass on her feast day, and when it was first read to me, it just struck me, and I went back and found the citation. And it's become kind of a life theme for me. She says this about you and about me: if you are what you were meant to be, you would set the world on fire. And I believe that to be true about you and me and your children and your grandchildren, students at University of Mary and the other 200 campuses that we serve, about everybody on earth, and they don't know it. That if you are what you're meant to be, you would set the world on fire. And we live in a cold, dark world waiting for the light and heat of you becoming who you're meant to be and setting the world on fire. So in the breakout session, we're going to get into how to do that. But together, as we're here in the larger session, I wanted to encourage you that your life, no matter how old or young you are, the lives of your children, no matter how close or far away from Christ and the church they are today, and your grandchildren and their lives, no matter where they are today, we've been called by a God who wants us to become who we're meant to be. And when we do that, we become what we're meant to be, by God's grace, we could set the world on fire. Thank you.